The room went still as my daughter slapped my hand away, her voice cold. Don't touch what isn't yours. Still, I didn't move, letting the sting of her words settle in. As the scent of flowers filled the air, I looked at the gift I'd brought with love, now rejected. While she turned away, I realized the real betrayal wasn't in the slap, it was in the growing distance between us. That's when I knew. I wouldn't let her tear our relationship apart over something so small. I would take back what I had given, no matter the cost. Wait, before we go any further, I gotta ask, where are you watching from? Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. The baby shower was supposed to be a celebration, a joyous occasion, a fresh start, a new chapter in Sophie's life. Lori had come with all the right intentions, bringing with her a carefully wrapped gift and a heart full of pride for the daughter she had raised. But as soon as she stepped through the door of the immaculately decorated home in the heart of suburban Chicago, something felt wrong. The air was thick with forced laughter and strained conversations. The soft hum of chatter buzzed in the background, but there was an unsettling tension beneath it all. Lori felt it the moment her eyes met Sophie's across the room. Her daughter, once so full of life and warmth, now stood by the refreshment table, avoiding eye contact. Sophie's smile, when she did offer it, was stiff, faint, almost apologetic. Gone was the familiar gleam in her eyes, replaced by an emptiness that Lori couldn't quite place. Lori made her way through the gathering, exchanging polite pleasantries with the other guests. But her focus never strayed far from Sophie. It was impossible to ignore how distant she seemed, how guarded. This was her daughter, her only child. They had always shared everything, from stories of high school drama to late-night talks about life's biggest questions. And now Sophie wouldn't even look at her. Sophie shifted uncomfortably as Lori approached her, offering a tight smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You look beautiful," Lori said softly, trying to make her voice sound casual, but it was clear that the words didn't quite land. Sophie nodded, but there was no warmth in her response. "Thanks, Mom. It means a lot that you're here." Lori could see that Sophie was holding something back. Some kind of wall had gone up between them. The ease and closeness they once shared felt like a distant memory. Still, Lori pushed it aside, determined to make the best of the situation for the sake of her granddaughter. She reached over to adjust a gift on the table, a delicate stuffed animal she had picked out with care, something she knew Sophie would love. Before Lori could even touch the toy, Sophie's hand shot out. Her fingers slapped Lori's hand away with startling force. "Don't touch what isn't yours," Sophie said, her voice cold and sharp. The room fell dead silent. Lori's heart stopped in her chest, the air suddenly too thick to breathe. Every eye in the room turned toward them, the hush almost suffocating. For a moment, all Lori could do was stare at her daughter, as if Sophie had just slapped her across the face. No, worse. This was a blow that went straight to the core of her being. Sophie's face was unreadable, her eyes now locked firmly on the floor, avoiding Lori's gaze. The smile was gone, and in its place was a distant, almost calculating look. Lori's hand still hovered in midair, frozen by the shock. She couldn't comprehend what had just happened. The silence stretched on, longer than it should have. Every moment felt like an eternity. Lori's pulse hammered in her ears as she processed the sting of Sophie's words, the unexpected cruelty. What had just unfolded? The slap of a hand was one thing, but this? This felt like something deeper, a chasm opening up between them. Her chest tightened, and the familiar tightness in her throat, a sign that she was on the edge of tears, began to creep in. But she fought it down, refusing to let anyone see her vulnerability. Not here. Not now. Forcing herself to look away, Lori took a step back. The room was still eerily quiet. the guests awkwardly shifting in place, unsure whether they should intervene or remain silent. Lori's eyes flicked across the crowd, searching for any sign of support, but there was nothing. Not even Rachel, her closest friend, who had been by her side for decades, was there to offer a comforting glance. Lori's heart pounded as she gathered her composure, her thoughts racing. She could feel the humiliation creeping up on her, but it was the confusion that truly gnawed at her. What had she done to deserve this? What had happened to her little girl, the one who had once crawled into her arms for comfort, the one who had shared her secrets and dreams? Without saying a word, Lori turned on her heel and made her way for the door. She could feel the eyes of the room on her, but she refused to acknowledge them. She wouldn't let them see her falter. Outside, the cold Chicago air hit her like a slap in its own right, but it didn't matter. Lori felt numb as she walked down the stone steps of the house, her heels clicking against the pavement with a steady rhythm, as if trying to ground herself in a world that had suddenly turned upside down. She didn't know where she was going or how long she walked, but the further she got from the house, the clearer the fog in her mind began to lift. The slap still burned on her skin, but it wasn't just the physical sting that haunted her. It was the weight of the words, the disconnection in Sophie's eyes. What had happened? What had changed? A heavy dread settled in Lori's stomach. This wasn't just about a simple misunderstanding. There was something more at play. Something dark lurking beneath the surface of her daughter's life. And Lori was determined to find out what. But first, she needed answers. And she was ready to dig until she found them. Lori couldn't shake the image of Sophie's face, so cold, so distant, burned into her mind. The slap had been a jarring, physical moment, but the real wound came from the way Sophie had looked at her, as though she were a stranger, a specter of the mother she used to know. Lori's heart twisted every time she thought of it, and the night after the baby shower, she lay awake, her mind spinning with unanswered questions. What had happened? What had changed? Sophie's behavior had been off for months, but Lori had brushed it aside. She'd been busy, caught up in the noise of her own life, until now. The baby shower had been the breaking point, the final piece of the puzzle that fell into place with a deafening crash. Lori sat at her kitchen table the next morning, a mug of coffee cooling in front of her. The sunlight spilled across the room, its warmth mocking the chill that had settled in her chest. Her hands were steady as she flipped through the photos on her phone, looking back at the happy moments. Sophie and Jake. So in love. So perfect. That's what everyone had thought, including Lori. They'd been a picture of suburban bliss. Jake, suave and charming, with a smile that could win over anyone, and Sophie, her bright, innocent daughter who had always looked up to him. But something wasn't right anymore. Lori closed the photo app and reached for her laptop. Her fingers hovered over the keys for a moment. She had never been the type to snoop. Trust had always been the foundation of their relationship. But this wasn't about invasion of privacy. This was about something far bigger. The slap, the coldness in Sophie's eyes, the defensiveness she had shown. Lori knew in her gut that something dark was going on behind the closed doors of her daughter's life. Lori had a sinking feeling in her stomach as she logged into Sophie's online banking account. She'd never done this before, but her instincts told her she had to. Sophie had always been careful with money. Well, until she'd met Jake. Lori had dismissed the small occasional gifts Sophie had bought Jake in the past, extravagant, unnecessary things. But looking back, it was the way he never seemed to contribute equally. Lori had brushed it off as part of their dynamic. But now, it felt like a red flag. As the account opened, Lori's eyes scanned the most recent transactions. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Groceries, utility bills, a few minor personal expenses. But then she saw it. A large, unexplained withdrawal, an amount too big to ignore. Jake's construction. the name of the business that always seemed to be shrouded in ambiguity. Sophie had never been forthcoming about the details of Jake's work, but Lori had assumed it was just another venture, something harmless. But now, as Lori clicked through the transactions, the numbers didn't add up. Large sums, withdrawn in cash, consistently linked to Jake's business expenses. Her heart pounded in her chest. The pieces began to shift, slowly falling into place. Lori closed the laptop and stared blankly at the wall. She couldn't process it all at once. There was something bigger happening here, something that reached far beyond a simple marital dispute. Lori's thoughts began to race. Money laundering. The words flashed in her mind like a neon sign. She remembered the way Jake had always been able to keep his affairs hidden, how he'd been so charming, so smooth. What if everything he had told Sophie was a lie? What if the business wasn't legitimate? And more importantly, what if Sophie had no idea? Lori's pulse quickened. She needed answers, and she wasn't going to get them by digging through bank statements alone. She had to know more, had to find out who Jake really was, what he was really up to. The decision was made in that moment. She would hire a private investigator. The next afternoon, Lori met with someone she had never imagined she would need, Greg Roberts, a seasoned investigator with graying hair and a face hardened by years of searching for the truth. His office was tucked away on a quiet street in Chicago's financial district, and the moment she stepped inside, Lori could feel the weight of the world shift. "Lori Hayes," he greeted, standing up from behind his cluttered desk, his voice steady and calm. "What can I do for you?" Lori swallowed hard, sitting down in the chair opposite him. She took a deep breath. "I need you to look into someone. My son-in-law, Jake Hayes." Greg's brow furrowed. "What exactly are you concerned about?" Lori hesitated. She wasn't sure how to frame the question. "I think he's hiding something. I think he's involved in something dangerous, and I need to know what it is." Greg nodded slowly, his fingers tapping against the edge of his desk. "All right, I'll get started. But you need to be prepared for what we might find." Lori leaned back in the chair, her hands trembling. She was prepared for anything at this point. She had already felt the cold grip of betrayal in her heart. And now, she just needed the truth. A week later, the investigator called her. "Lori, I've got something for you." Lori's breath hitched. She stood up, pacing the room as she held the phone to her ear. "What did you find?" Greg's voice was low, measured. "Jake Hayes is mixed up with some very dangerous people, criminals. It goes beyond his business. There's a money laundering scheme running through several fronts, and it all leads back to him." Lori's knees went weak. She collapsed onto the couch, gripping the phone tighter as if it might slip from her hand. "Are you saying he's been stealing from Sophie?" she whispered, barely able to believe the words coming out of her own mouth. "Not just Sophie," Greg said, his voice dark. "He's been siphoning money from her inheritance. He's using her funds to cover his tracks and fund his operations." Lori's world tilted as the gravity of the situation crashed down on her. All those months of trusting, believing, and loving her daughter's husband, and now the truth was clear. Jake had been manipulating Sophie from the start. He had turned her life into a web of lies and deceit, and now, Lori was the only one who knew. Her mind raced with possibilities, but one thing was certain. She couldn't let this continue. Sophie had to know the truth, even if it meant tearing her world apart. Lori clenched her jaw, the fire of determination igniting within her. Jake's reign of manipulation was over. Lori stood in front of Sophie's house, her breath shallow, hands trembling as she clutched the manila envelope containing the damning evidence. The crisp envelope felt like a stone in her grip, heavier with each passing second. She had been planning this moment for days, rehearsing her words, knowing she had to be strong. But now, as she stood on the doorstep, the reality of what she was about to do hit her with full force. Sophie and Jake were inside. It had taken all of Lori's willpower not to break down when Greg, the investigator, had handed her the final report. The truth was there, in black and white. Jake had used Sophie's inheritance, money that was supposed to secure her future, to fund his criminal empire. Money laundering, embezzlement, and worse. It wasn't just that he'd lied to her daughter, it was that he'd used Sophie as a pawn in his games, using her love for him as a shield. Lori rang the doorbell, her heart thudding in her chest. It was almost too much to bear, but she couldn't back down now. She had come this far. She had to make Sophie see the truth. When the door opened, Sophie's face lit up for a split second, before the smile faltered. She looked at Lori, eyes flicking to the envelope in her hand. "Mom? What's this about?" Sophie's voice held a mix of confusion and concern, but Lori could hear the distance in it. The wall Sophie had built between them was still there, and it was thicker than ever. "Sophie, we need to talk," Lori said, her voice steady but raw. "Both of you, now." Sophie hesitated before stepping aside, allowing Lori to enter. The familiar smell of jasmine from the air fresheners, the soft hum of the dishwasher in the background, it all seemed so normal, so calm. Yet the air between them was charged, like the calm before a storm. Jake was sitting on the couch, his usual confident, almost cocky demeanor replaced with something guarded, his eyes darting between the envelope in Lori's hand and her stern expression. "What's going on, Lori?" Jake asked, his voice smooth, but there was an edge to it. He knew this wasn't going to be a casual chat. Lori set the envelope down on the coffee table, watching as both their eyes followed the movement. She could feel the weight of her next words pressing down on her chest. "I know what's been going on," Lori said, her voice low, controlled. "I know about the money, Jake. About how you've been using Sophie's inheritance to fund your criminal activities. I know about the money laundering, and I know you've been lying to her." The silence that followed was suffocating. Sophie's face twisted with confusion, her brow furrowing. "Mom, what are you talking about?" Sophie's voice trembled slightly, but she quickly masked it with a defensive edge. "You're overreacting. This isn't what you think. Jake would never do something like that." Lori's gaze hardened, her anger rising in a slow, simmering tide. "I have the proof, Sophie. I've seen the transactions. I know everything." Jake's eyes narrowed as he leaned forward, his body language shifting from casual to something darker, more threatening. "Lori, you need to stop with these wild accusations," he said, his tone smooth, but there was a coldness beneath it. "You're just trying to destroy everything. You're trying to tear apart our family. I've been nothing but good to Sophie, and now you're trying to ruin it all." Lori's jaw tightened as she turned her gaze back to Sophie. "Don't let him manipulate you anymore. This isn't just about money. This is about him using you. Using your trust to get away with his lies. Do you really think he's been honest with you?" Sophie recoiled, her eyes darting away from Lori. "You're wrong," she whispered. "You don't understand. You just don't understand what Jake and I have." Jake leaned back into the couch, his arm casually draped over the back, his gaze shifting back and forth between mother and daughter. There was something cold in the way he watched them, like a predator waiting for the right moment to strike. "You've always been a little paranoid, Lori," Jake said, his voice a sickly sweet blend of sympathy and condescension. "But you've got it all wrong. Sophie and I have built something special. You think you can just waltz in here and destroy that with your accusations? You're only hurting her." Lori's heart cracked at his words, the venom in them cutting deeper than she expected. It wasn't just the lies. It was the way he turned her own words against her, like he'd been doing to Sophie for years. His charm was a weapon, and Sophie had fallen for it, hook, line, and sinker. Sophie's face turned pale as she glanced between them, her voice shaking. Mom, Jake's right. You're just being paranoid. I can't believe you'd do this to us. We're happy. You're trying to ruin everything. Lori shook her head, her throat tight with frustration. She refused to let Sophie continue to live in the fog of Jake's lies. You don't get it, Sophie. You're not seeing him for what he really is. This isn't just about him keeping secrets from you. This is about him taking advantage of you, using you for his own gain. And you're letting him. There was a long pause as Sophie's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly wiped them away, refusing to meet her mother's gaze. She faltered, her voice barely a whisper. I knew about the affair, Mom, but I didn't know. I didn't know how deep it went. The confession hit Lori like a slap, and for a moment she couldn't breathe. Sophie had known? How could she have known and still stood by him? Sophie. Lori's voice cracked as she struggled to understand. You knew about the affair, but you didn't know he was using your inheritance? How could you not see what he's doing to you? Sophie's face flushed, her eyes a mix of shame and anger. You've never understood me, Mom. You've always been so quick to judge. I love Jake. I made my choices. And I won't let you tear my life apart because of your suspicions. Lori's chest tightened, a mix of anger and heartbreak flooding her at the sight of her daughter's stubbornness. Sophie's loyalty to Jake blinded her, and no matter how much Lori wanted to help, Sophie couldn't see the truth. But Lori wouldn't back down. Not now. I'm not trying to tear you apart, Sophie, she said softly, her voice trembling with emotion. I'm trying to save you. The silence that followed was heavy, suffocating. Sophie's eyes were filled with pain, and Lori knew, deep down, that her daughter wasn't ready to hear the truth. Not yet. But Lori was determined to make her understand, no matter how long it took. Lori sat at her kitchen table, the soft hum of the refrigerator the only sound in the otherwise silent room. Her mind was a storm of conflicting emotions, anger, fear, frustration, but most of all, a relentless drive to uncover the full truth. She had learned so much about Jake's lies, his manipulation, and the way he had used Sophie for his own gain, but something in her gut told her there was more, something darker. She had thought she'd seen the worst, but what she was about to uncover would shake her to the core. Greg, the investigator, had called again. This time, the news was even worse than she could have imagined. Jake's ties to organized crime weren't just rumors or whispers. They were real, and they ran deeper than she had ever expected. The money laundering scheme wasn't just a small-time operation. It was part of a much larger, more dangerous network. And Jake was at the center of it all. Lori's fingers tightened around the edge of the table as she read through the file Greg had sent her. There were names, people in places she never expected to hear about, connections to criminal organizations, gambling rings, even human trafficking. Jake's business ventures had been a cover for all of it, a front to funnel money and launder it through seemingly legitimate transactions. Her heart pounded in her chest. This was no longer just about a man lying to his wife. This was about something far more dangerous, something that could ruin their lives in ways she couldn't yet understand. Sophie, still blind to it all, had been pulling away more and more, each day. The tension between them had only grown since their last conversation. Sophie had refused to see the full picture, even though it was right in front of her. Lori had tried everything, every gentle approach, every plea. But Sophie was still too loyal to Jake, too afraid to face the truth. Lori's resolve hardened. She couldn't wait for Sophie to come to her senses. She had to act. The final confrontation was coming, and she couldn't afford to hesitate. Not anymore. She spent the next few days preparing, setting a trap for Jake that would expose him once and for all. She knew how dangerous this was. If he found out what she was doing, There was no telling what he might do to her or Sophie. He had already shown his true colors, but now Lori was playing for keeps. She had to catch him in the act, had to gather undeniable proof that would break Sophie's delusion and destroy Jake's web of lies. Everything hinged on this moment. As the day of the confrontation approached, Lori could feel the weight of it pressing down on her chest. She wasn't just walking into Jake's world, she was walking into a trap of his making. He would be expecting something. He would be ready. She couldn't afford to make a mistake. That evening, she sat across from Sophie, trying to maintain her calm, though every nerve in her body was on edge. Sophie had been distant lately, even more so than usual. But tonight, Lori saw something different in her daughter's eyes. A flicker of doubt, a crack in the armor Sophie had built around herself. "I don't know what to do, Mom," Sophie said softly, her voice trembling as she stared into her cup of tea. "I've been thinking about everything you've said, about Jake. But it's just so hard to believe. Everything feels like a lie, but I don't know how to let go." Lori's heart ached as she reached across the table, placing her hand over Sophie's. "I know, sweetheart. I know it's hard. But you don't have to do this alone. I'm here, and you deserve to know the truth." Sophie's eyes welled with tears as she pulled her hand away, shaking her head. "I don't know if I can face it, Mom. I don't want to believe that he's been lying to me all along, but I keep seeing the signs. The way he acts, the way he hides things. And now, this. I'm scared." Lori leaned forward, her voice gentle but firm. "You've been scared for too long. You're stronger than this, Sophie. You have to see him for who he really is. You have to see the danger before it's too late." Sophie stared at her, her eyes searching Lori's face as if trying to find something to hold on to. "I don't know if I'm ready for this," she whispered. "What if I lose everything?" Lori's voice softened, her own heart breaking as she said, "Sometimes, sweetheart, we have to lose everything to find ourselves." Sophie didn't respond. Her gaze shifted to the window, her mind clearly 1,000 miles away. But Lori knew, deep down, that the seed of doubt had been planted. It wasn't much, but it was a start. Sophie wasn't blind to Jake's manipulation anymore. Lori's phone buzzed in her pocket, pulling her out of her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. "Greg." Her stomach flipped as she answered, her voice steady despite the dread curling in her chest. "Greg? We've got him." Greg's voice was low, but there was a hint of triumph in it. "Jake's planning to move a large sum of money tonight, and I've got the location. We can catch him in the act." Lori's pulse raced. This was it. The moment she'd been waiting for. The evidence. The proof that would finally end Jake's grip on Sophie. "I'll be there," Lori said, her voice quiet but resolute. She ended the call, her eyes meeting Sophie's one last time. Sophie looked at her, a mixture of fear and determination on her face. "What's going on, Mom?" Lori stood up, her heart heavy with the weight of the choice she had made. "I'm going to end this. I'm going to make sure you're safe." Sophie stood up too, stepping toward her mother with hesitant steps. "I don't want you to do this, Mom. Not alone." Lori shook her head, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm not alone, Sophie. I've got you." And with that, she walked out the door, the final confrontation looming ahead. Jake wouldn't see it coming. The air outside felt colder than it should have. Lori stood at the edge of the parking lot, her breath visible in the chill of the early evening. The night was descending quickly, and with it, the weight of the final confrontation. The trap had been set. Jake's every move was being tracked, and tonight, it would all come to a head. The truth would be exposed. She looked over at Sophie standing by her side, her expression unreadable. The younger woman was pale, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, as if trying to hold herself together. It had been hours since their last conversation. When Sophie had finally broken down and admitted that everything Lori had warned her about had been true. Sophie had known about the affair, but never this. The money, the lies, the criminal network. Sophie had felt as though the ground had been ripped from under her, the man she thought she loved turning out to be a stranger. But now, with the evidence in hand and the police involved, she had finally agreed to help. This wasn't just about loyalty anymore. It was about survival. "I'm scared, Mom," Sophie whispered, her voice barely audible against the wind. "What if this goes wrong? What if Jake—" Lori placed a firm hand on Sophie's shoulder, her own pulse quickening. "He won't get away. We've got this. The police will be there." Sophie nodded, though her eyes were full of doubt. Lori couldn't blame her. This was bigger than either of them. Jake had been running his criminal operations for far too long, and now the entire web of lies was finally unraveling. But in this moment, with everything at stake, Lori knew that they had no choice but to see it through. The night was thick with tension as the police moved into position. Lori's heart raced as she checked her watch. It was almost time. Jake had been planning to leave the country tonight, his flight booked for the early morning. He thought he could escape, disappear with Sophie's money and everything else he'd taken. But Lori had a plan of her own. The sound of distant cars reached her ears, and soon, a black SUV pulled into view. It was Jake. His figure was unmistakable in the driver's seat. He had no idea that tonight was the night his empire would fall apart. Lori held her breath, watching as Jake's vehicle came to a stop near the airport's private hangar. "This is it," Lori murmured, turning to Sophie, who was already wiping away a tear. She could see the pain in her daughter's eyes, the heartbreak, the betrayal. But there was also something else. A glimmer of relief, knowing that Jake's lies would finally be exposed. Lori could only hope that Sophie would find peace after this. The road ahead would be long and difficult. The emotional toll would stay with them for a while, but at least tonight, Jake would face the consequences. "Ready?" Lori asked quietly. Sophie nodded, swallowing hard. "Ready." The plan was simple, but dangerous. The police would move in as soon as Jake entered the hangar, catching him red-handed with the stolen funds. Lori had done everything she could to make sure the operation went off without a hitch, but a part of her still feared what might happen. She'd seen how ruthless Jake could be. She had no idea how far he'd go to escape. Lori watched from the shadows as Jake stepped out of his car, a briefcase in hand. She could feel the tension in her bones, every nerve on edge. This was the moment. She couldn't look away. The police were in place. Greg, the investigator, gave her a nod from behind a nearby car. The trap had been set. Everything was poised for the final blow. Then, as Jake began to walk toward the hangar, something unexpected happened. His phone rang. Lori's heart skipped a beat as she watched him answer it, his back to her for just a moment. She knew it was his final chance, his final attempt to flee, before everything came crashing down. Lori didn't hesitate. She moved forward, stepping out from the shadows, her voice firm but steady. "Jake," she called, her voice cutting through the night air. Jake froze, his body stiffening as he turned toward her. His eyes widened for just a fraction of a second before his usual cool composure took over. He knew he was trapped. There was no getting out of this. "What the hell are you doing here?" Jake snarled, his grip tightening on the briefcase as he looked around, scanning for any way out. "This is over, Lori. You're messing with forces you don't understand." Lori stepped forward, her heart pounding. "No, Jake. It's over for you. I'm not letting you get away with what you've done. You've lied to Sophie. You've used her. You've stolen from her. And now, you're going to pay." Jake's lips twisted into a sneer as he took a step forward, his voice low and dangerous. "You think you've won? You have no idea who you're dealing with. You don't get to tear my life apart. Not now, not ever. Before Lori could react, two police officers stepped out of the shadows surrounding him. Jake's face contorted with rage as he dropped the briefcase to the ground, his hands balled into fists. You think you can stop me? He hissed. You think you're some kind of hero? I'll make sure you both regret this. You're nothing. But it was too late. The officers were already moving in, cuffing him, reading him his rights. He struggled, trying to break free, but the police held him firm, dragging him away. His associates were quickly arrested as well, each one caught in the web of his illegal activities. Lori stood there, watching the scene unfold in front of her as the weight of the moment settled on her shoulders. For a brief moment she couldn't move, couldn't speak. The shock of it all was almost too much to bear. But as she turned to Sophie, she saw the tears in her eyes, tears that were a mixture of grief and relief. Thank you, Sophie whispered, her voice breaking. I don't know what to say. You've saved me from a lifetime of lies. Lori pulled Sophie into a tight embrace, her own heart heavy with the cost of everything that had happened. The battle was over, but the road ahead was uncertain, and it would take time to heal. As the police led Jake away, his eyes met Lori's one last time. There was nothing but contempt in his gaze. But to Lori, it was the look of a man who knew he had lost. The final blow had landed, and with it, a new chapter for both mother and daughter had begun. The quiet was the first thing Lori noticed when she woke up the morning after everything had happened. For the first time in months, there were no ringing phones, no hurried meetings, no whispered threats in the dark. It was as if the world had paused for a moment to let her breathe, to let her think. But even in the silence, the weight of the battle lingered. Sophie was in the kitchen when Lori stepped in, her face still drawn from the events of the previous night, but there was something different in her eyes, something softer, more open. It was as if the heavy cloud that had followed them for so long was finally starting to break apart piece by piece. Sophie met her gaze, and for the first time in a long while, Lori saw her daughter without the walls that Jake had built around her. Morning, Mom, Sophie said quietly, her voice still carrying the strain of everything they'd been through. Morning, Lori replied, her own voice thick with emotion. She crossed the kitchen and hugged Sophie, tight enough to make up for the months of distance between them. It wasn't enough to fix everything, but it was a start. Sophie pulled away first, wiping her eyes, a hesitant smile forming on her lips. I'm still processing it all, you know? It's like, how could I not have seen it? How could I have been so blind? Lori cupped Sophie's face gently, her thumb brushing away a tear. It wasn't your fault, sweetheart. You were manipulated. You weren't supposed to see it until it was too late. Sophie nodded, the pain in her eyes clear. But it's not just about Jake, is it? It's about everything. The lies, the money, the people I trusted. It's all been one big lie. I don't even know who I am anymore. Lori's heart ached for her daughter, knowing the road ahead would be long and uncertain. You'll find your way, Sophie. We'll do it together. In the weeks that followed, Lori watched as Sophie slowly began to heal. She started therapy, something Lori had insisted on from the beginning, and though it was hard for Sophie to face the full extent of the damage, there was a glimmer of hope in her eyes every time she spoke about her sessions. It wasn't an easy process. Some days were better than others, but each small step forward was progress. Lori, too, had her own healing to do. She had spent so many years fighting for Sophie, fighting to protect her, that she'd neglected her own emotional scars. The betrayal was still fresh, the wounds still raw. But Lori knew that for her to be there for Sophie, she had to be strong. So, she threw herself into something she knew would make a difference. A week after the operation, she stood in front of a small crowd at a community event, her heart heavy, but her voice steady. She had started a foundation for women who had been victims of financial abuse and manipulation, something that had taken root after everything that had happened with Jake. She spoke about the importance of financial independence, about how women needed to protect themselves from the kind of emotional and financial traps Jake had set for Sophie. The room was filled with women who nodded, who understood. There were so many stories like Sophie's. Too many. By the time she finished speaking, Lori felt a sense of purpose she hadn't realized she'd been missing. She wasn't just fighting for her family anymore, she was fighting for every woman who had been silenced by the kind of abuse she and Sophie had endured. Sophie attended the event with her, standing quietly by her side as Lori spoke. Though she wasn't ready to share her own story yet, there was a quiet strength in the way she listened. Lori knew, deep down, that Sophie was finding her voice again. She was taking back control of her life. But even as Lori began to make strides with her foundation, the emotional toll of everything that had happened wasn't something that could be fixed overnight. The pain of losing someone she had trusted, someone she had thought would always be there for Sophie, stayed with her. The anger at Jake, at what he had done to their lives, simmered just below the surface. It was hard to completely let go of the rage. Still, there were moments of peace, moments when Lori would sit across from Sophie in the quiet of their home, the sound of rain tapping gently on the windows. They didn't need to say anything. They were just there, together, rebuilding the connection they had once lost. One evening, as they shared a cup of tea, Sophie turned to her mother, her eyes brimming with gratitude. "Mom," she began, her voice thick with emotion, "I know I'll never be able to repay you for everything you've done, for saving me. But I want you to know, I'm going to make it right. I'm going to be okay. I just, I need time." Lori smiled, her heart swelling. She reached for Sophie's hand, squeezing it gently. "You don't need to repay me, sweetheart. You've already done that by choosing to fight for yourself." It was a small, simple moment, but it was everything. The love, the understanding, the quiet resilience. Lori knew the road ahead would still be difficult. Sophie had a long way to go before she could fully heal, and so did Lori. But for the first time in a long time, they had a future together. A future not defined by the past, but by the strength they'd found within themselves and each other. Sophie wasn't the only one who had been freed. Lori had too. The final chapter wasn't written yet, but it was theirs to decide now. The future was uncertain, but for the first time in years, Lori could finally breathe. They were alive, they were strong, and they were moving forward. Lori sat in the dim light of the living room, her gaze fixed on the fireplace. The crackling of the wood was a welcome sound, but it didn't drown out the thoughts that had been swirling in her mind since the moment Jake had been arrested. The weight of the battle had been heavy on her shoulders, but the victory had come with an unexpected cost. There was a hollow space inside her, an emptiness that hadn't been there before. The relief that had flooded her heart when Jake was taken away had quickly faded, leaving behind a sense of unresolved tension. She glanced at Sophie, who sat beside her, her eyes red from the tears that had fallen in the days since everything had come to light. It wasn't just about what Jake had done to them anymore. It was the burden of the emotional wreckage left in his wake. Sophie's gaze was fixed on the cup in her hands, her fingers absent-mindedly tracing the rim. She hadn't said much in the last few days, and Lori could see that the fight for survival wasn't over. Sophie's battle with herself was just beginning. "I should have seen it, Mom." Sophie's voice was low, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of her guilt. "I should have known. How could I have been so blind to everything? How could I have let him use me like that?" Lori reached for Sophie's hand, squeezing it gently. "Sweetheart, you didn't see it because he hid it from you. He manipulated you, and you were in love. You were deceived." Sophie shook her head, her eyes brimming with unshed tears. "But I let it happen. I let him control me. I ignored all the signs. I feel like I let you down. I don't know how to forgive myself for that." Lori's chest tightened. She wanted so badly to take away Sophie's guilt, to shield her from the hurt that had been caused. But she knew that healing couldn't come with just words. It had to come from within. "You're not the one who needs to be forgiven, Sophie. You've been through something no one should have to go through, but you can't keep carrying this weight. You have to let it go, or it will keep you from moving forward." Sophie looked up at her, her eyes searching for something, some reassurance that things would get better. And in that moment, Lori realized that the healing they needed wasn't just about forgiveness, it was about safety. Not just physical safety, but emotional safety. But that wasn't the only danger they were facing. The threats had started coming in. At first, it was subtle. A strange phone call here, a threatening email there. But then, the notes started arriving at the door. Anonymous threats scrawled on scraps of paper, reminding Lori that Jake's criminal associates were still out there, still lurking in the shadows, and they weren't finished with her yet. Lori had hoped that once Jake was behind bars, the threats would stop. But instead, they had escalated. The fear she had kept at bay was now a constant companion, a shadow that followed her every step. She couldn't let her guard down, not when Jake's reach was still so strong. She stood up abruptly, pacing across the room. "We need to be more vigilant. We can't let them intimidate us into silence. We've already lost so much. I won't lose any more." Sophie looked up at her, her brow furrowed with concern. "What are you going to do?" Lori turned back toward her daughter, her face hardening with resolve. "I'm hiring extra security. I can't afford to take chances. Not with everything we've been through." Sophie nodded slowly, the weight of the decision pressing down on her. She didn't want to live in fear anymore, but she understood why it was necessary. Lori was right. The fight was far from over. And as much as they wanted to heal, they couldn't ignore the threats that still hovered like a storm cloud over their heads. Lori went into her office and made the call, setting up the security arrangements. She wasn't sure how long it would take before she felt truly safe again, but at least now, they had the means to protect themselves. It was a small comfort, but it was enough to give her some peace of mind. Later that evening, as the house settled into a quieter rhythm, Lori sat by the window, looking out at the darkened street. She had made it through the worst of the storm, but the winds of change were still howling around them. And while she was certain they'd never be the same after all that had happened, she also knew that they had the strength to rebuild. Sophie had made progress. She was still processing everything, still figuring out who she was outside of Jake's web of lies. But Lori could see the cracks in her armor, the armor that had protected her from facing the truth for so long. And with each step, Sophie was learning to stand on her own. But as Lori watched her daughter sleep later that night, a new thought crept into her mind. The battle against Jake's network was over. But what about the future? What did it look like for them now? She hadn't thought about her own future in a long time. Everything had been about Sophie, protecting her, guiding her through the storm. But now that the storm had passed, Lori realized that she was at a crossroads. She had been so focused on survival, on getting Sophie out of danger, that she hadn't taken time to think about herself. What did she want? What did she need? The foundation for women's financial security was growing, but that was just the beginning. She'd put her heart into it, but there was something more, something deeper, that she needed to explore. It was time to rebuild not just for Sophie, but for herself. She was stronger than she'd ever been before, and she had a purpose. But the road ahead wasn't going to be easy, not with the threats still hanging over them, not with the emotional scars still fresh. Lori closed her eyes for a moment, taking in a deep breath. She wasn't just surviving anymore. She was living, and she wasn't going to let anything, anyone, take that away from her again. The sun had set by the time Lori and Sophie arrived at the venue, a spacious ballroom in downtown Chicago. It was an event meant to honor those who had made a difference in the community, and tonight, Lori would be one of them. But the recognition felt more like an acknowledgement of survival than victory. Lori had grown accustomed to fighting for the people she loved, especially Sophie. But now, the battle had shifted from protecting them both to finding a way to move forward, to thrive. Sophie, who had once been so closed off, now stood beside her, offering a tentative smile. It wasn't the same carefree smile Lori had known before, but it was something, and Lori clung to it. As they entered the ballroom, Lori's heart pounded in her chest, not from fear, but from a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. A year ago, she'd never imagined that her life would unfold like this. From fighting Jake's manipulation to standing before a crowd of people, speaking of her pain and triumph, it felt like a lifetime ago. But here she was, surviving, breathing, and proud of the woman she had become. Lori felt Sophie's hand slip into hers, a gesture that was becoming more frequent. They weren't healed, but they were rebuilding, and that was enough for now. A woman approached them, her heels clicking sharply against the marble floor. "Lori Hayes," she said with a smile. "You're the woman of the hour, I hear." Lori returned the smile, though it was still a little uncertain. "I'm just here to help raise awareness. That's the real victory." The woman nodded, impressed. "Still, your courage has made an impact. Your bravery in confronting the truth. It's inspired so many." Lori felt a warm flush rise to her cheeks, but before she could respond, Sophie tugged at her sleeve. She pointed toward the stage at the front of the room, where a group of women were preparing to speak. Lori followed her gaze to see a podium with a plaque waiting for her, a public acknowledgement of the work she'd done for women's rights and financial abuse prevention. The moment they called her name, Lori's legs felt like jelly. She had prepared herself for this. She had spoken at small gatherings, met with survivors of financial abuse. But standing in front of a crowd of strangers, knowing she was about to share her own story of survival, felt different. This time, it wasn't just about the cause. This time, it was personal. As she walked up to the podium, Sophie squeezed her hand, silently offering support. Lori took a deep breath and began to speak. "When I first started this journey, I had no idea how much it would change me, how much it would change my family. I didn't just survive an abusive marriage. I learned that survival is about so much more than just staying alive. It's about reclaiming your voice, your strength, and your independence." The words flowed from her, raw and honest. She spoke of the manipulation, the lies, the years of living in a web of deceit. She spoke about Sophie's strength, her ability to break free from Jake's hold. And, of course, she spoke about the foundation she had started, the women she had met along the way, and the commitment she had to helping others. The room was silent as Lori finished, but the applause that followed was thunderous. She hadn't expected it. It wasn't about the recognition, it was about the connections she'd made, the women who had reached out to her, telling her their stories of survival. As the applause died down, Sophie stood from her seat, eyes glistening. She knew the battle wasn't over for her mother or for herself, but she had seen how strong Lori had become. Her mother had turned their pain into power, their grief into purpose. And in that moment, Sophie knew that she wasn't the only one being healed. Later that evening, as they sat at a table with other advocates, Sophie leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so proud of you, Mom. You've turned everything we've been through into something good." Lori smiled softly, her hand resting on Sophie's. "We're not done yet. We've only just begun." But even as the night drew to a close, Lori knew that this wasn't just about them anymore. It wasn't just about the foundation or the work she was doing to help women escape financial abuse. It was about herself, too. Lori realized that she had not only saved Sophie, but in doing so, she had saved herself. She had found her purpose. Days later, as the recognition continued to pour in from local communities, Lori's phone rang. It was from a national women's organization, one that had been following her work. They wanted to honor her at their next event, in front of an even larger audience. Lori smiled as she heard the news, but it wasn't the honor that struck her the most. It was the realization that she had come full circle, from being a victim of betrayal and manipulation to becoming a beacon of hope for others. Lori leaned back in her chair, staring out at the evening sky. The path ahead was clear now, though it wasn't easy. There would be challenges, there would be moments of doubt. But the fight was no longer about surviving the darkness. It was about embracing the light. Her phone buzzed again, pulling her from her thoughts. She glanced at the screen. It was a text from Sophie. "I'm ready to move forward, Mom. Together." Lori's heart swelled. It wasn't just the work they were doing. It was the connection they had rebuilt. The bond that could never be broken. As Lori responded with a simple, "Me too," she realized that their journey was just beginning. And no matter what came next, they were ready for it. The months following the public recognition had been a whirlwind, but the fog of uncertainty was finally beginning to lift. Lori's life, once ruled by the shadows of Jake's manipulation and the chaos of trying to protect her family, was slowly transforming. She no longer woke up to the weight of constant fear, but to the thrill of new possibilities. Sophie was thriving, her healing taking root in ways Lori hadn't imagined. They were both healing in different ways. Sophie rebuilding herself from the emotional wreckage of the past, and Lori reclaiming control over her future. But the most surprising change of all was the idea of a future they could now build together. Lori had always been a fighter, but now she had a new purpose: helping other women reclaim their lives, their independence, and their voices. The foundation had grown into something bigger than she'd ever anticipated, and with Sophie now by her side, the impact they were making was tangible. They had started small, but now Lori was ready to expand. She had a vision, one that reached beyond Chicago and into communities across the country. She wanted to create a safe haven for women who had experienced financial and emotional abuse, a place where they could regain their independence and rebuild their lives. The first step was starting a business focused on helping women regain financial independence. It was more than just a career for Lori. It was the legacy she wanted to leave behind. Sophie, now emotionally and financially independent, was the perfect partner to help Lori build this new chapter. She had found her own footing in the world and was working alongside her mother with a passion and drive that only someone who had been through what they had could understand. Together, they were unstoppable. The business began to take shape, offering workshops, financial planning, and legal resources to women who were in toxic relationships or trapped in cycles of financial dependence. Lori had always known that the key to breaking free from manipulation and abuse was knowledge and empowerment. With Sophie's help, they began to create a network of resources and connections that would allow women to find the support they needed to escape and rebuild their lives. One day, just as the business was gaining momentum, Lori received an unexpected phone call. It was a philanthropist, someone who had been following her story and was moved by the work she was doing. This person wanted to make a donation, a large one, to help Lori expand her foundation and reach even more women. The offer was humbling, and as Lori listened to the words of encouragement on the other end of the line, she couldn't help but feel a wave of gratitude. This was a new beginning, one she had fought for, one that wasn't just about surviving, but about thriving. With the additional funds, Lori was able to open new offices, hire more staff, and create a mentorship program for women looking to take back control of their financial futures. It was the beginning of a new era for Lori and Sophie, a future where they could change lives, starting with their own. But it wasn't just the business that had changed. Lori had changed too. She was finding herself again, rediscovering the woman she had once been, before the manipulation and the fear. She had spent so many years living for Sophie, fighting to protect her, that she had forgotten to live for herself. But now, with each new step forward, Lori was reclaiming that sense of independence and self-worth that had been buried under the weight of her past. And with that newfound freedom came something unexpected: love. But not in the way Lori had once imagined it. She wasn't searching for a partner. She wasn't looking to fill the empty spaces that Jake's betrayal had left behind. No, this time, Lori was in love with herself, the woman she had become, the strength she had found, the life she had built from the ashes of her past. She had never felt more complete. One afternoon, after a long day of meetings and phone calls, Lori sat at her desk, looking over the notes for her next speaking engagement. She had been invited to speak at a women's empowerment event across the country, where she would share her journey and her work. For the first time, Lori felt at peace with what she had accomplished. She was no longer just a survivor. She was a leader, a voice for those who had been silenced for far too long. Sophie entered the room, her face alight with excitement. "Mom, you won't believe it. The first round of grants for our mentorship program just got approved. This is really happening." Lori smiled, her heart swelling with pride as she stood to embrace her daughter. "We're doing it, Sophie. We really are." They stood there for a moment, holding each other, mother and daughter, united not just by blood, but by everything they had fought for. They had survived, and now they were thriving, side by side. As the months passed, Lori traveled the country, speaking at events and empowering women to take control of their lives. She shared her story of survival, of reclaiming independence, and of the importance of financial literacy in escaping abusive relationships. She had become a beacon of hope for so many women who felt trapped in the same way she once had. Sophie, always by her side, continued her own work with the foundation, counseling women who had come to them for help. She had found her own voice, her own purpose, and she was now part of a growing movement of women who were no longer afraid to stand up for themselves. One night, as Lori sat in the quiet of her office, her phone buzzed with a message from Sophie. "We did it, Mom. We really did it." Lori leaned back in her chair, a deep sense of fulfillment washing over her. They had made it through the darkest moments of their lives, and now they were standing in the light, stronger than ever before. It wasn't the end of their story. In fact, it felt like the beginning of something even greater. And as Lori looked out the window, the city lights reflecting off the glass, she knew that whatever came next, they would face it together, united, unstoppable, and free. It was a crisp autumn morning when Lori stood at the front of the room, the sound of soft murmurs filling the space. She had been speaking at events like this for months now, sharing her story, speaking about the foundation she had built from the ashes of her past. But today, something felt different. This wasn't just another speaking engagement. This was a milestone. She was finally starting to see the true impact of her work, the lives she was changing, one woman at a time. Lori glanced out at the audience, a room full of women who had come to find hope, to reclaim their independence, just as she had. Her foundation, which had started as a small initiative, was now helping hundreds of women across the country. They were offering not only financial assistance, but also mentorship, emotional support, and legal resources. The stories she heard each day, stories of survival, resilience, and growth, were overwhelming, but they fueled her passion. Her voice steadied as she spoke. "When I began this journey, I never imagined it would become what it is today. We started with a small group of women, all facing their own struggles, but together, we found strength. Together, we learned how to reclaim our independence. Today, we continue to grow, not just as a foundation, but as a movement. The applause was steady, and Lori felt a deep sense of pride. This was what she had fought for, the moment when her pain was no longer just her own, but shared with women who understood it, and with those who could find strength in it. In the back of the room, Sophie watched her mother, her eyes filled with admiration and something deeper, a quiet respect for the woman she had become. Sophie had always known her mother as strong, but now she understood the depth of that strength. Lori had faced darkness, had risen from it, and now she was a beacon for others. Over the months, Sophie had grown into a woman of purpose herself. Once unsure and clouded by the trauma of her marriage to Jake, she had found her voice. It was Sophie who had helped organize the mentorship programs, working closely with women who had come through the foundation seeking support. Her personal experience, her own journey from victim to survivor, made her an invaluable asset to the foundation. But it wasn't just the work they did together that had changed their relationship. It was the way they had come to understand each other, to respect each other's journeys. "Sophie, I don't know what I'd do without you," Lori had said one evening after another long day of meetings. "You're the heart of everything we've built." Sophie smiled softly. "I'm just trying to live up to the example you set. You showed me that my voice matters." And it did. Sophie had become an advocate for women's rights, using her personal experience to inspire others. She shared her story at local events and helped other women find their own strength, just as she had. As their work grew, so did the recognition. Lori had been invited to speak at a major United Nations event, a turning point in her journey. It was surreal to think about. The woman who had once been controlled by fear and manipulation was now standing before world leaders, speaking about financial abuse and the importance of empowering women to take control of their lives. Standing backstage before the event, Lori felt a rush of emotions: nervousness, excitement, and gratitude. When she stepped onto the stage, the weight of the moment hit her. But it wasn't fear that held her. It was a profound sense of responsibility. This wasn't just about her anymore. It was about all the women who had found hope through her work. "I stand here today," Lori began, her voice steady, "not just as a survivor, but as a voice for the countless women who have been silenced, manipulated, and controlled. My mission is to empower every woman to stand tall, to reclaim what was taken from them. Financial independence is freedom, and with freedom comes strength." The applause that followed was louder than she had anticipated. It wasn't the applause that mattered, though. It was the fact that she had a platform, and it was hers to use for change. Back home, as the foundation continued to grow, Lori began a new initiative. She had started a scholarship fund for women who needed assistance in starting their own businesses or escaping financially abusive situations. It was a natural next step in her mission, one that would allow women to break free, not just emotionally, but financially. The scholarship fund was designed to help those who had no other way out, to offer them the resources to start over, to take back control. Lori knew the emotional scars would take time to heal, but financial freedom could be the key to the doors of a new future. But as the days passed and Lori watched her vision expand, she couldn't help but feel the weight of everything they had endured. The battles, the heartache, the fear. It was all behind them, but the scars remained. Lori and Sophie would never go back to who they were before. They had been through too much, fought too hard. Yet, the scars weren't just marks of pain. They were symbols of strength. They had survived, together. They had overcome, together. And now, they were stronger than ever before. As Lori sat at her desk reviewing the latest proposals for the foundation, her phone buzzed with a new message. It was from Sophie. "We did it, Mom. We're changing the world, one woman at a time." Lori smiled, her heart swelling with pride as she typed back, "Yes, we are. And we're just getting started." The legacy Lori had built, alongside Sophie, was one of empowerment, strength, and resilience. And together, they would continue to create a world where women could stand on their own, no longer held back by the chains of financial and emotional abuse. But in that moment, as Lori looked out over the city skyline, she knew that her story was still unfolding. This was just the beginning. Lori had been living in the light for months now, a life forged from the ashes of manipulation and fear. But as she sat at her desk, the weight of the past seemed to settle back into her bones. The phone calls had started again. Not the threatening messages she had once received. Those had subsided after Jake's arrest, but something far more unsettling. This time, it wasn't just about her. It was about Sophie. Lori had thought they were free. She had believed that after everything they'd been through, Jake's criminal network had been dismantled, that the worst was behind them. But now, in the quiet of her office, she knew that wasn't the case. She had been too naive to think it was over. Sophie, who had found her own footing in the world, had been targeted again. A note had arrived at their house, left in the shadows of their doorstep. This time, it wasn't anonymous. It was a warning. A reminder that there were still people loyal to Jake's memory, people who hadn't yet been captured, and they wouldn't stop until they had their revenge. Lori's hands trembled as she read the words. "You think you're safe? We're just getting started." It was the last straw. Lori could no longer pretend the past was behind them. They weren't just fighting for their lives anymore, they were fighting for their future. The decision was final. She couldn't let Sophie be a target again, couldn't let these criminals take anything else from them. She had fought for too long to let fear control her. No. This time, it was going to end. Lori picked up the phone, dialing the number of Greg Roberts, the private investigator who had helped expose Jake's network. She had always kept in touch with him after the arrest, though she had hoped she wouldn't need him again. But now, there was no other choice. "Greg," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "I need your help. We have to sever all ties with Jake's associates, once and for all." Greg's response was immediate. "I'll get started right away, Lori. But you need to be careful. These people don't forget easily. If they know we're coming for them, they'll strike back." Lori didn't hesitate. "I don't care. It ends now." She enlisted help from the authorities, and together with a small group of trusted friends, people who had been with her every step of the way, she began gathering the final pieces of evidence to expose the remaining criminals in Jake's network. It wasn't just about shutting them down. It was about ensuring that they could never hurt Sophie or anyone else again. Days passed in a blur. Meetings with law enforcement, surveillance, and hours spent in front of computer screens, piecing together the final clues. Lori could feel the weight of every decision she made, the gravity of the risks they were taking. But she was determined. She had come too far to let this threat linger in the shadows. Then, one evening, it all came to a head. Lori received an encrypted message from Greg. The final pieces were in place. The criminal network was on the move, and they had one last chance to catch them before they disappeared again. The plan was set. Lori and Sophie would confront the last of Jake's associates, face to face, and expose them for good. Lori knew this would be the most dangerous moment of their lives, but she wasn't afraid. She had faced too much already to back down now. As the evening approached, Lori felt a strange calm settle over her. She couldn't shake the sense of finality that clung to her. She had lived in the shadow of fear for too long, and now she was taking control. She was walking into the darkness, but this time she wasn't alone. Sophie was with her. Sophie. Lori had seen the toll this fight had taken on her daughter, the emotional scars from Jake's manipulation, the way Sophie had struggled to find her own identity after years of being controlled. But now, Sophie was stronger. She had found her voice. She had found her own strength. And as they prepared for the final confrontation, Lori saw the determination in Sophie's eyes. This wasn't just about protecting her anymore. This was about Sophie reclaiming her life. But then came the unexpected. Sophie, who had been quiet in the days leading up to the confrontation, suddenly spoke. "Mom, I have to tell you something." Lori turned to her, confusion flickering across her face. "What is it, sweetheart?" Sophie took a deep breath, her hand resting gently on her stomach. "I'm pregnant." Lori's heart stopped for a beat. She had always imagined this moment, the moment when Sophie would become a mother, but never like this. She had always hoped Sophie would have the chance to choose her own future, free from the shadows of the past. But now, in this moment, Lori saw a new strength in Sophie, a new reason to fight. This child, this new life, would be her anchor. Sophie would not be a victim anymore. She would build a future on her own terms. Lori took her daughter's hand, her voice steady. "We'll do this together. For you. For the baby. And for every woman who's been hurt by people like Jake." Sophie nodded, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I don't want to live in fear anymore, Mom. This is my life now, and I'm going to take control of it." The final confrontation was imminent. They had the evidence. They had the plan. And no matter what came next, Lori knew this was their moment. The end of one chapter, and the beginning of a new one. The police were in position. The criminals were closing in. And Lori, standing tall by Sophie's side, was ready to face them head-on. As they moved toward the final showdown, Lori's thoughts turned to the future. She had fought for her daughter. She had fought for their freedom. And now, nothing would take that away from them. The months since that final confrontation with Jake's associates had passed in a blur. Lori often found herself replaying that moment, the one where everything changed. The confrontation had been tense, but ultimately, it had been the last step in severing ties with the dark past that had haunted her and Sophie. In that moment, Lori knew it was over. Jake's network, once a looming threat, was dismantled, and with it, the grip it had held on their lives. Now, as Lori sat in her favorite chair by the window, looking out over the city skyline, she could scarcely believe how far they had come. A year ago, she had been standing in the shadows, fighting to protect her daughter from a man who had taken everything from them. And now, she was living in the light, a beacon of strength for others who had been through similar battles. The sound of soft laughter from the kitchen pulled her from her thoughts. Sophie was in there, preparing a meal for the two of them. Lori had never imagined that they would be here, sharing a quiet evening together, free from fear. Sophie, now a new mother herself, was beginning her own journey of independence. It wasn't just the baby growing inside her, it was the sense of freedom she now carried with her, free from the past. Free from Jake's manipulation, free to choose her future. Lori's heart swelled as she watched Sophie set the table, her hands gently resting on her growing belly. The past was still a shadow, but it no longer had the power to dictate their lives. Lori had fought for this moment, for Sophie, for herself, and for the future they would build together. She had made sure that no one would take that freedom away again. Sophie caught her eye, smiling as she set a plate in front of Lori. "Everything okay, Mom?" Lori smiled back, her voice filled with pride. "Everything's perfect. More than I ever thought it could be." As they sat down to eat, Sophie shared stories about her work with the foundation, her own journey from survivor to advocate. She was no longer just her mother's daughter. She had found her own voice, her own purpose. And Lori couldn't be prouder. But the journey wasn't over. As much as Lori was grateful for how far they'd come, she knew the fight for others like them was just beginning. That's why she kept traveling, speaking at events, sharing her story with the world. She had become a beacon for countless women, those who were trapped in toxic relationships, those who were struggling to find their independence. Through her speaking engagements, Lori reached millions, giving them the courage to reclaim their own lives from the grips of abuse and manipulation. "I can't believe how many women have reached out to me," Lori said, her voice steady with conviction. "It's like they see themselves in my story. They want to believe that they too can rebuild." Sophie nodded, her eyes soft. "Because they can. We did. And now, so many others are starting to find their way, just like we did." The bond between them had strengthened beyond measure. The scars of the past remained, but they no longer defined them. The love between Lori and Sophie had been tested in ways most mothers and daughters would never understand, but it was unbreakable. They had fought side by side, and through that, they had rediscovered the true power of their relationship. As Lori continued to speak at events and raise awareness for financial abuse, she made sure that the future generations would never face the same kind of manipulation that Sophie had endured. She set up a trust for Sophie's child, making sure that this new life, this next generation, would be protected. No child of hers would ever be subject to the same kind of manipulation or control. The cycle would end with them. Sophie's pregnancy had become a turning point. It had given her the courage to step into a new chapter of her life. She wasn't just fighting for herself anymore. She was fighting for her child, for their future. And Lori was there, every step of the way, helping to shape a future that was free from the past's shadows. One evening, as Lori stood by the window, looking out at the city once more, a feeling of peace washed over her. She had done what she set out to do. She had saved Sophie from a life of manipulation and deceit, and in doing so, she had saved herself. She had built a legacy, a foundation that would empower women for generations to come. She knew the road ahead would still have challenges, but for the first time, those challenges felt like opportunities. Opportunities to build something better, to continue to help those who needed it most. Her phone buzzed with a new message from Sophie. "I love you, Mom. I'm ready for whatever comes next." Lori smiled, her heart full. The future was uncertain, but one thing was clear. They would face it together, stronger than ever before. As she looked at Sophie, now standing beside her with a small hand resting on her stomach, Lori knew that this wasn't the end of their story. It was just the beginning. They had survived. They had thrived. And now they were about to create a legacy that would change the world. Lori sat at the kitchen table, the soft morning light filtering through the windows, casting a golden glow over everything. It was peaceful here, quieter than she had ever known it to be. The noise of the past, the fear, the uncertainty, the constant pressure, was gone. Now, there was just the sound of Sophie in the next room, humming as she prepared breakfast. It was a new beginning, not just for Lori, but for Sophie too. She was no longer just the daughter caught in the chaos of a toxic relationship. She was a mother herself now, a woman who had fought through her own darkness and come out stronger on the other side. Together, they had built a life that was as strong as the love that connected them. Lori looked across the table at the foundation's paperwork that lay in front of her. The progress they had made over the past year was staggering. What had started as a simple idea, helping women break free from abusive situations, was now a nationwide movement, touching the lives of thousands. With Sophie now by her side, Lori had taken the next step. They had expanded their reach, opening new centers in different states, offering workshops, mentorship programs, and even emergency funds for women in crisis. The foundation had become a lifeline for many, and Lori was more committed than ever to growing it, ensuring that every woman who reached out for help would find it. As she reviewed the latest reports on the Foundation's impact, a feeling of pride washed over her. But even with all the success, Lori knew that the journey was far from over. She was no longer just an advocate. She was a leader. And with that leadership came the responsibility of making sure that future generations would never again suffer the way she and Sophie had. Sophie entered the room carrying a tray of coffee and freshly made pancakes. She set it down in front of Lori, the smile on her face radiating joy and contentment. They shared a look, one that spoke volumes of everything they had fought for and everything they had yet to achieve. "I've been thinking," Lori said, her voice low but steady. "I think it's time I write the book, share everything. My story, what we've been through, and how we rebuilt." Sophie nodded, her hand resting on her stomach, a gentle reminder of the new life she was bringing into the world. "It's your story, Mom. It's time the world hears it. There are so many women out there who need to know they aren't alone." The thought of writing had lingered in Lori's mind for months, but it had always felt like something she wasn't ready for. Now, with Sophie by her side, and with the foundation thriving, it felt like the right moment. She wanted to share the truth, the raw, unfiltered journey she had been on, not just as a survivor, but as a woman who had learned to stand tall again, reclaiming everything she had lost, and then some. As Lori made the decision to begin the process, she felt a sense of purpose crystallize. This book wouldn't just be a memoir, it would be a guide for other women. Women who had been silenced, ignored, and oppressed. A roadmap for how to reclaim their lives, their power, their financial freedom. But it wasn't just the book that was on Lori's mind. Sophie, too, was planning for her future. With each passing day, she was finding herself more rooted in her own independence. She had already been working with the foundation, but now she was looking toward what came next, for herself, and for her child. There was a spark in her eyes that Lori hadn't seen before. It wasn't just the glow of pregnancy. It was the spark of a woman who had found her way out of the darkness and into the light. "I've been thinking about what I want for my child," Sophie said one evening, her tone thoughtful. "I want them to grow up in a world where they feel safe, where they know that no matter what happens, they have the power to choose their own future." Lori smiled softly, reaching across the table to take Sophie's hand. "And that's what we're giving them. A future where they can stand strong, no matter what." It was a future that Lori was determined to build, not just for Sophie's child, but for every woman who came through their doors, looking for a way out of a life they didn't choose. That's why Lori was also pushing for legislative change. Her voice had reached far beyond the speaking events, beyond the Foundation's workshops. It was time to bring the fight to the halls of power, to make sure that laws protecting women from financial abuse and manipulation were enforced. Together, Lori and Sophie worked tirelessly, pushing for change at the state and national level. They partnered with other advocates, lawmakers, and survivors, speaking out for those who had been silenced for too long. Each victory, no matter how small, was a step forward for women everywhere. The bond between Lori and Sophie had evolved into something unbreakable, a partnership that went beyond mother and daughter. They were a team, a unit stronger than anything that had tried to tear them apart. Through their shared experience, they had not only survived, they had thrived. And as the future unfolded before them, Lori stood tall, knowing that she had not only rebuilt her own life, but had helped to build the future for countless others. The road ahead wasn't always going to be easy, but it was theirs to walk, together. With their love, their resilience, and the knowledge that no one, not even the shadows of the past, could ever take that away from them. Lori stood backstage, her heart pounding in her chest. The sound of the audience behind the curtains was muffled, but she could feel the weight of it, the expectation, the anticipation. This was the moment, the culmination of everything she had fought for, everything she had rebuilt after years of manipulation, fear, and heartbreak. The Global Women's Rights Summit was a dream she hadn't dared to entertain just a few years ago. And now, here she was, ready to speak to a room full of people who looked to her as a symbol of strength, resilience, and hope. She wasn't just a survivor anymore, she was a voice, a leader, standing on the world stage to talk about the fight against financial abuse and empowerment for women. Her hands were steady, but her mind was racing. This was what she had worked toward, what she had fought for. The chance to help other women reclaim their lives from the very darkness she had escaped. But even as she prepared to step into the spotlight, there was a quiet sense of peace within her. She had walked through the fire, and now, she was helping others find their own way out. "Are you ready?" a voice asked from beside her. It was Greg, the investigator who had been by her side through it all. Lori nodded, giving him a small, reassuring smile. "I've never been more ready." The moment was now. Lori stepped forward, the stage lights blinding her for just a moment before her eyes adjusted. The room was vast, filled with people who had come to hear her speak. Women from all corners of the world, all with their own stories of survival and strength. She took a deep breath and began. "I stand here today, not just as a survivor of financial abuse, but as a mother, a daughter, and a woman who has learned the true meaning of freedom." Lori began, her voice steady and clear. "I stand here because I refuse to let the past define me. I am here because I refuse to let the darkness control the future of any woman." The room fell silent. The weight of her words settled on the audience as she continued. "I fought for my daughter. I fought for her freedom, her safety, and her future. And through that fight, I found my own strength." We often think of survival as just getting through the worst, but it's more than that. Survival is about rebuilding, reclaiming, and empowering ourselves to rise above what others have tried to take from us. As Lori spoke, she glanced toward the back of the room, where Sophie sat with her newborn child. Sophie, the woman she had fought so hard to protect, was now a mother herself, a symbol of everything Lori had hoped for when she had first begun this journey. Her daughter was no longer the victim, she was the survivor, strong, confident, and ready to build a life of her own. Sophie smiled back at her mother, her eyes filled with pride and gratitude. Lori felt a rush of emotion as she saw the woman Sophie had become, the woman who had broken free from the chains of her past and was now shaping her own future. Lori took a moment, the words she had been rehearsing in her head for so long now flowing freely. The journey to freedom isn't an easy one. It requires strength, courage, and sometimes it requires the help of others. But it is a journey worth taking. And when we find our voice, when we stand tall, we begin to see that the chains that once held us are not nearly as strong as we believed. She paused, allowing her words to settle in the room. She could feel the energy shift as the audience connected with her story, their stories. The applause that followed was overwhelming, but it wasn't just for Lori. It was for every woman who had found the strength to stand up, to reclaim what was rightfully theirs. It was for Sophie, for the countless others who had walked this same path. Later that evening, after the event, Lori found herself in a quiet moment with Sophie, away from the crowds, away from the applause. Sophie was holding her baby, her expression soft as she gazed at her mother. "I'm so proud of you, Mom," Sophie said, her voice thick with emotion. "You're not just a survivor anymore. You're a beacon for all of us." Lori smiled, reaching out to take Sophie's hand. "We did this together. Everything I've done for you, for your future, and now, for my grandchild's." Sophie nodded, the weight of the moment settling in. She was no longer just Lori's daughter. She had found her own purpose, her own voice. She was free, and her child would never know the kind of fear or manipulation that had once ruled her life. As they stood together, Lori thought about the journey that had led them here. She had come so far, from the slap at the baby shower, to fighting for her family's freedom, to now standing before the world, speaking for women everywhere who had been silenced. And yet, this was just the beginning. The work Lori had started would continue. It wasn't just about surviving anymore. It was about thriving. It was about ensuring that every woman had the tools, the resources, and the courage to take back control of her life. Lori glanced out at the city skyline, her thoughts turning to the future. There were still battles to fight, still laws to change, still women to reach. But for the first time in a long while, Lori felt at peace. She had fought for everything she had, and now she was standing in the light, no longer defined by the darkness of her past. As Sophie's child cooed in her arms, Lori looked at her daughter, feeling the unbreakable bond they had built. Together, they had reclaimed their lives. Together, they were going to change the world. The fight wasn't just mine, Lori said, her voice full of conviction. It was for every woman who deserves to be free. And now, that freedom is ours. And in that moment, as Lori and Sophie walked side by side, with the world ahead of them, they knew that the future they had built together would be their legacy.